Good afternoon, everyone. Now, my apologies. I'm running a bit late today because I'm actually having a little bit of a struggle with the technology. It's kind of like you'd think I went on a holiday and then I kind of forgot how to do things. It's probably a little bit of that. Um, the other joy of being away, and I'm sure lots of people, seems like everybody knows somebody with COVID at the moment, right? So, I can be included in that. That was me over Christmas, my family too. So it's just one of those things that I think a lot of people are experiencing. Maybe I'll blame that for my memory loss. Could work. All right. So I'm going to talk to you today about change management. And the reason that I wanted to talk to you about change management coming into the new year was really because a lot of the things that we do when we take some time away from work is that we often sort of start thinking about creative ideas that we might have about improving things. A lot of people find they might start new roles or different things as well. And so they might, change a role within the organization, something that might sort of lead us to think that the organization in some way, shape, or form needs to experience some change. Now, I'm just going to apologize ahead of time just because the way that I was cramming this together this morning. I can't get I can't get the streaming of my slides without actually showing you the outline of the slide deck thing. So you know what? I'm just going to show that to you, and we'll just have to deal with technology being not quite my friend today. So I wanted to talk to you just generically about setting the stage for change. But before I kind of do that, see, now I can't even make it move ahead because I'm not actually clicking on the thing in my screen. It's just bizarre. I wanted to just sort of welcome everybody, and I wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind putting into the chat box where it is that you're actually streaming from. And if you're looking at this live, or whether or not you're actually coming to this later on and looking at the recording of today's webinar, because some of you will be actually looking at this later on. Even at that time, it's good if you want to just kind of put in the comments that you're watching the recording and where you're actually watching from, so that I can get a bit of an idea about where people are tuning in from. And also, if there's anything specific that you wanted me to talk about today, if there's a particular question or an issue that you might be having in your work environment, just so that I can sort of help you get the best out of your time today. The reason, and just when we come back, I'll come back to some of the comments, but one of the reasons I wanted to, just address this is there's a big issue around change as it impacts in terms of psychological risk. So when we talk about preventing psychological risks in organizations, the biggest risk factor is actually a change process. And so when we start thinking about making changes, one of the biggest things that we have to stop and look at is that firstly, there's the change that you think as the leader in the organization needs to change, but then the way we go about implementing change is the thing that will either create a psychological risk or not. So it's a really useful thing. So I can see a few people kind of making comments about that they're watching live. So great to see you, Hannah, watching live from home at this point, probably a safe place to be. A couple of other people, Anne's at work, Claire's at work. Oh, a couple of other people who are overseas. So useful to see. Now, let's just talk about the implication about the psychological injury risk and why it's a big problem, and why we want to focus on how you effectively manage that sort of stage of change management within the organization is really about this as being the biggest risk factor. So 92% of serious workplace injury claims are attributed to work-related mental stress each year. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a pretty hefty number in my mind. And when we start talking about workplace stress, what we're actually talking about is pressure that we kind of experience in the work environment that seems to be there often in an unnecessary way. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those sort of stress management issues that can come up. Part of it is about whether or not the work environment that you are in is a reactive or a proactive work environment. And what I mean by that is, if you work in, a large organization where you've got a steady delivery of, if it's government or even non-government entities, but you've got a service area that you sort of work on, but it might be that you work in more of a policy related area, or something that doesn't specifically have deadlines or timelines where particular things need to, happen. That's more of a, what I would call, a proactive work environment. You get time to plan ahead, to work out what it is that you're trying to deliver, and who you're delivering it to, and there's not really any hard or fast tight deadlines that you need to be tied to. The alternative to that is a reactive work environment, and part of that can be planning to a deadline is not necessarily a reactive work environment. That's still proactive because it's ahead of time and you get an opportunity to map things out. Reactive is, customer service areas where what it is that you're actually dealing with is whatever's presented or put in front of you. Emergency services are often those things. There's some proactive work or some sort of background work that we can go to when there's nothing else that's reactive and in our face and demanding our attention. So what we find is that reactive work environments can bring with them their own kind of stress. And so if it's busy, so we see that in emergency service areas like, our health sector at the moment is a reactive work environment that's highly pressured because we've got a reduced number of available staff with appropriate skills because they're getting ill themselves. And we've got this increased demand on the other side. So that pressure cooker is actually something that is front and center. We know that it's there. We can't do anything about it because it is just a product of, external circumstances that are just happening to kind of mush together in a situation that can't be helped. We've got limited or finite resources on one side, and we've got increasing demand on the other. So when we stop and think about how COVID's been managed over time, it was actually all about managing that pressure on the health sector. So that's the kind of thing that we need to understand about the different kind of work environment that we operate in, and then what kind of pressure that puts on the person who's operating in that environment. So we see where we have highly pressured environments like, fire brigade, for example, especially if they're doing rural or remote stuff, then, the fire season is a time of year where people know that we're going to experience more of these things. Emergency services, floods, we know that when we get high levels of rainfall like we've got at the moment, there's periods of time where we can kind of pre-plan that it's going to be extra stressful, and we need to make sure that we've got appropriate people on the ground and trained and enabling them to do that. So a big part of this is about looking at what within the work environment, and everybody's work environment's different, obviously. What is it that you can pre-plan and respond to, and what are the things that come with external deadlines or pressures that they're completely out of your control. And the reason that we have to understand how change management impacts this, as I said, because it's the biggest risk factor for psychological injuries. And what's the issue with that? Well, the employers are responsible for those psychological injuries, both in terms of cost, but also in terms of preventing them. So what happens if we don't prevent psychological injuries? Well, our workers claim premiums will go up because we'll end up with an increased number of workers' compensation claims. And though the responsibility for the mental health of your people is now firmly in the hands of the employer. And we've seen this quite a lot through COVID, that this is a big thing where a lot of businesses and a lot of organizations are saying, we don't feel prepared for the fact that we've now got to hold this person's, not only their physical kind of being and presence, and make sure we've got all of their work environment safe for them to work, but we now also have to hold their mental health and their capacity and emotional stability in mind when we're kind of asking asking them to do a particular role. And it's something that I've heard a lot in the last couple of years that people don't feel prepared for. They don't feel like they have the right skills or experience or knowledge to be able to, manage this risk factor in an appropriate way. So I wanted to try and talk to you today about when we want to make a change in the work environment, what are the things that you need to do to ensure that you're minimizing your risk for a psychological injury as a result of that change process? So let's have a look at some of the, a bigger part of the problem. So the bigger part of the problem comes down to the numbers that we're talking about. These are literally safe work statistics. A psychological injury claim is going to see that person out of work on average for about 18 weeks. And one of the things that we know about psychological injury claims is usually there's another statistic that says if they're out of the work environment for 3 months or more, the chances of ever getting them back are pretty well Buckley's and none. So what's the issue? If the issue is on average 18 weeks that somebody's out, what's the chance that we're really likely to get them back into our work environment? Pretty minimal. Now that's a big problem from an employment perspective, not only in the fact that you then have those premium issues with regards to your workers' comp, but also the fact that you then have to then retrain somebody else, but you've always got this permanent position kind of idea that's sitting over here maybe for this person to come back to. So it's a huge cost and impost on you as the employer if that situation is arising in your business. So one of the things that I just want to have a look at in terms of that 18 weeks, also it's about the actual cost. The actual cost of a psychological injury is around $32,000. Now, that is literally the average cost of a physical injury is, well below 2,000. So it's big. This is a massive problem. And the psychological injury claims represent about 12% of all serious claims. So, who am I to talk to you about all of this? See, you can see where my pictures go off the page now. I was written up at one stage about, being Australia's most influential woman in mental health. I think there are lots of influential people in mental health, but maybe I just talk louder than most. So I want to just address some of these things in regards to, what are the 4 keys that you need in order to prevent a psychological injury developing from a change management process. And those 4 keys at the very top level is consultation, communication, support, and review. Now, as we go through, if you think that I've missed anything or you think there's something else that I should have addressed, please feel free to put that into the comments as we go, and I will get to a point at the end where I'll come in and I'll address that. But, if you feel free on the way through to see anything or ask any questions, just do that. All right, so let's talk about consultation, because what's the issue? We need to look at when we decide as a leader that we want to make change, there's usually a problem we're trying to solve, and we think that the problem will be solved if we actually implement change in a particular way. So what we want to do then is we need to take what we're assuming is the problem. Now, I'm not saying all change will go through this process, because part of this might be you've decided as the leadership team to make a change because you've consulted along the way. As long as you've done the consultation process with the staff, what you'll do is you'll end up with a collaborative problem-solving approach that says, okay, we've thought about this quite a bit, we've bandied these ideas around, but what we've come up with is this collaborative problem-solving approach that says we listen to the people at the front end who might be the ones that are delivering the service that we've got this problem that we need to address, whatever it is, and we've heard their input, and we've tried to accommodate that in the solution that we're proposing. Now, it's really important in that consultation process, even if you've already decided as the leadership team what you think the problem is and what you think you need to do to resolve it, if you don't have some level of consultation process with everybody involved across the organization, you don't get buy-in. And the reason that you don't get buy-in is because we want to be consulted, right? We as human beings, it's a natural part of how we are as people. We want to be able to be consulted in anything that's going to affect us. And when we work full time, the majority of your waking hours are spent at work. And you want to think that you have some autonomy and control over the work that you do. Now, it doesn't matter if you are, a young person working on the front line at McDonald's, following a particular process. If I decide that I'm going to, as the leader of that McDonald's, put in a new, just say it's a computing system or an order taking system or something, and I can sit there and tell you that you just have to use this new thing and this is how you use it. And you'll get people who will accept that change, but you will get people who will resist it. And the best way to kind of do it is then if you go, oh, we're thinking we're going to upgrade our systems and we're looking at this system or this system, even if all you do is go, hey, would you mind having a look and telling us what you think? They've at least felt that you're hearing them, that they've had an opportunity to give you some input about the change that you think the organization needs to make. And we do this a lot with technology. And then the larger the organization, the more consultation you actually have to do, because you need to ensure that at all levels you've kind of made people feel that they've had an opportunity to have a voice. And that's what actually creates buy-in. At the end of the day, they may not agree with the decision that you make, but if they feel that they've been consulted in it, then they're more likely to go along with it regardless. So this is about looking at that connection and how do you actually create that internal pulse check within your business or within your organization about what's going on, what's the problem that you're trying to address, and whether or not the change is actually a necessary one. Because we often do go in when we're away and we're thinking about these things, and that's why I wanted to spend the year starting about change management, because it's a common time that we all decide that we will do it. Is the change really necessary? Now, sometimes it's an efficiency gain, sometimes it's a technology improvement because we think it's going to create some, positive thing down the track. But sometimes it's just about checking in about whether or not what we perceive as a problem is actually really a problem for the person who's, doing that job. And the common one is those technology changes where we've been told by the salespeople who created the technology that this is the U-Butte thing and we're going to bring this in and it'll do all of this stuff. I've seen it actually, particularly in large government organizations, where systems changes and systems improvements that have been brought in for a particular reason often fail in their use or their implementation because there's a couple of things that don't get followed. Consultation is one, and then that mandated kind of whether or not this is a change that everybody has been clearly told needs to happen. And I'll talk about documentation, and that's part of it, but it's that consistency of the message. So if you don't have that consultation process, remember what I said about the feeling not consulted, you get this judgment perspective from the staff that you're actually trying to put the change in place for that blocks the change. It's this anti-buy-in. It's the, you're unreasonable, you didn't listen to me, you're just rude. Or especially if you're new to an organization, a lot of new leaders will come in and they kind of want to stamp their mark and say, I'm really valuable. I was brought in here to do this great thing because I'm really good at it. And they want to come into an organization and feel like they've, shown their value from the get-go. And I say to new leaders, when you go into a new role, don't make any change for at least 3 months, right? I know you want to go in there and make it feel like it's, your own, but any change that you kind of do before you start getting that lay of the land with those people just puts people offside and they don't like it. And you get this negative, like real anti-judgment stuff that comes in. So, when you go into a new role, you want to spend some time just talking to people about, what it is that they do, what they like about their role, what they don't like, what they think works well, what they think doesn't work well. And, do they want to do anything different? Because that's the stuff that gets them to feel that you're actually, interested in who they are as people, what they bring to the table, and whether or not they're satisfied with what it is that they're doing in your organization. Gives you some really good insight into people. So the next thing comes up is really about communication. And we often find that everybody's different, right? And we often get very different perspectives. And the main thing that we have to remember when we start looking at the different perspectives that people have about, you know, a particular problem is that we just have to listen to the different perspectives and see if we can communicate or mediate a way to some sort of middle ground. You will always have people within any organization who have opposing views about the same problem. And, you, you get this in families, you get this in friendships, two people in the same room have the same experience, arguably, but they'll both have different perspectives on that situation that they were in, even when they were in the same room together. So the communication and the recognition with the different sort of perspective elements is just an important thing to acknowledge and to take on board. As long as you're listening and you're validating that person's perspective, doesn't matter whether or not you adapt it, agree with it, put it in place, whatever, it's still that perception of feeling that they've been heard. And it's a really important part of it. Then the other side of it is about communicating the rationale and the reason for the change. So, it's about the process. It's not about the person. And by focusing on the process that's causing a problem, even if the problem seems like it's that person's role that's affected by it, and let me use that McDonald's example again. The front staff person who's standing taking the order, if the McDonald's franchisee decides they want to put in a new computing system because it's going to allow that order to be taken quicker, if we talk about the fact that it's a system thing and it's about helping them to do their job in an easier way, we're talking about improving the process. We're not talking about making that person faster in their job. Does that make sense? Because it's obvious, it's a really big distinction that we often just skim over, but it's a really important point that if we're bringing in a system improvement because it's going to allow that person to work faster, we need to talk about the fact that the process improves the outcome of the role, not that we think they have to work faster or work harder, because the negative reversal, like what they are actually hearing, is that you don't think they're working hard enough. And that's where I always say, when you're talking about a change or an improvement process, it's about the process. It's not about the person. So it's not about the person doing the role. It's about the process around the role the person does, right? And it seems like a minor thing, but it really makes a big difference to a person's perception about whether or not they want the change to come in because they think that, are you being supportive of them, or do you think they do a great job, or, something else. And this is part of why, through a change process, we have to support people. We need to give both practical support, as in we're making physical changes. If it's a computing change, making physical change to your workstation, let's just check in and make sure that the workstation is now set up in the way that it needs to. We're doing this so that we can minimize anybody's, chance of getting a back injury, whatever it is, right? But we need to support people through the change process in understanding why the change is necessary, so the practical changes, and then the emotional stuff. Because a lot of people, we get very tied to the things that we kind of own in our role. And so sometimes, and I've seen this when I've done work with organizations where we go in and we kind of look at a process and kind of go, actually, there's some efficiency gains that can be made in here. I will always then work with the people who do that manual work. And if we're going to replace that manual process with a technology process, then I'll always work with them to help understand what the problem is for them. Now, for them, it's often about time. And so sometimes if we just talk about improving replacing a person's time with a system, then they fear that they won't actually have a job left. So they'll resist that change quite a lot. We need to kind of talk to them about how can we help them improve that, this process, so that it would free them up to have more time on something that's probably a little more proactive rather than reactive in their work stuff. And that helps them to feel like they're not so pressured by actually having to do all of this manual processing stuff because we've now got this streamlined process. So a lot of it is about how we deliver the information, and that's where that communication comes in, but also that sense of really supporting the person in understanding that we're not trying to streamline a process so that we can get rid of them because we're just about efficiency gains. We're actually trying to help them to be less stressed by improving a process so that it happens more efficiently. And there's a really big mindset difference in the way that we communicate it and making sure that we're supported. So when we talk about stress, all stress management actually requires a plan. And I can count on one hand out of all of the organizations I've worked with over time who has a stress management plan. Some places might have a mental health strategy. They don't have a stress management plan. And yet, in reality, when we look at different roles, go back to what I said about the reactive and the proactive, like the proactive sort of stuff where we can plan ahead, but what's reactive, we don't actually have anything that says when we know that we get these pressured situations that are outside of our control, what can we do to assist people to best manage stress? And we don't talk about it. And yet it's your obligation as the employer to manage this stuff for them so that they don't feel so stressed that they end up off work. So, how do we do that in a way if we just haven't even thought or planned for it? And most organizations don't even plan for it. They expect their people to manage their own stress. Now, we've seen for a range of reasons, especially over COVID, people don't plan this sort of stuff for themselves. And when they get overwhelmed, they don't actually have anything to fall back on about how they're going to manage their own stress. We find that all of a sudden people are, people will notice it themselves. They're drinking more, or they're being avoidant, or they're not turning up to work as much. They're taking more time off because they don't feel like that within the workplace they can manage that stress. Now, this is an important thing that we need to kind of manage to make sure your organization can continue to deliver things without lost productivity. So a big part of that is then looking at the engagement that you get from your people in the work that they're doing and the improvements or the outcomes that they're actually getting. Now, depending on the size of your organization, a lot of the strategic rationale for why we need to do certain things in the business never gets communicated down the line. So I always say, depending on a small enterprise is a bit different. If you've got less than 20 staff, it's a little bit easier for people to kind of get an overview of that strategic sort of perspective of where you want to take the business. But as the organization grows and you get up over 50 staff, 200 staff, let alone into the thousands, what we start to really see is that you can get a lot of people who are disenfranchised and therefore disengaged because they don't have any clear link between the role that they do when they turn up to work every day and how that actually improves that outcome of the overall business itself. Go back to the McDonald's kind of thing that I was talking about. For most people, you working at Macca's when you're a young person, you're just there to do the job to get the money to go and hang out with your friends, right? That's a standard thing. But they're actually trained to follow a specific process, and it's a reactive environment. Okay. Do they need to understand the strategic outcomes that you're trying to sell more burgers to make more money because there's more profit? They'll kind of get that at a base level. But, on the whole, they're just there to turn up to get paid to, go and hang out with their mates. The outcomes are quite different. But, you go into a full-time job and you're spending more and more of your time, waking time, at work rather than spending time with your loved ones. What happens? You want to know that that time is valued and that time is doing something that's meaningful and making a contribution. Your disenfranchisement in work is always going to be about not noticing or not having that kind of connection. Now, at different points in our lives, our work outcome becomes more or less important. And sometimes people are only turning up to do a job, same as the Macca's example, to get a paycheck and sort of go home, and their focus is on the stuff outside of work. But for most people, even in that scenario, you want to keep them engaged with what it is that you're trying to do and deliver, so that they are turning up and actually delivering in their most effective and efficient way. So engagement is actually quite an important one. And then it's about the documentation of a change process. It's actually documentation of anything. Most organizations that I go into, actually we find that the majority of the perception around the differences between this area and that area is often a perception based on a lack of documentation, particularly around HR processes and those sorts of things. If an organization doesn't have clear policies documented about different elements, what we find is that those people they get really upset because they have a perception that these people over here are treated differently to them. And so when we look at any change process, the easiest and best way to ensure that we get that consistency is referring everybody back to a central point of documentation about the change, what the change is going to do, what the problem that the change is going to solve, and then, the updates to any documentation that change might have had an impact on, so that they can kind of see it, and there's that central reference point. Because conversations will always be misinterpreted in some way, or they'll be understood differently by this person than it is to that person. But if those things are actually written down, and I want to say in a really clear, unambiguous way, because I've seen some documentation that is so wordy and airy-fairy that you can't actually work out what it means. And it's also so wordy and airy-fairy that it means that people can kind of interpret it this way or that way. You want to really use simple, common, plain English, so that, Joe Bloggs and Mary Fraser down the road both read that same paragraph and understand what it means for them. Documentation elements and the interpretation of them is a really big problem in lots of places. Then looking at that post-change, when you've made a transition or you've made the change and you've got that thing that's there saying, hey, it's complete, we've finished our change process, what review do you do to make sure that the change that you had decided you wanted to make is the change that you did make and had the effect that you said it was going to make, right? Because we only ever change to solve a problem. Well, that's the only reason we should be making change, really, is to solve a problem or to improve that, make an efficiency, because the inefficiency is a problem, right? So when we do that, we really have an obligation to go back and go, okay, so did that do what we thought we were going to do? It's part of standard project management that you actually do, the post-implementation review. What's the wash up? What's our lessons learned? What did we get from this process that means that we can improve next time we do a process? It's a common thing, but often what happens is when we've decided we're going to make the change and fix the problem, we go, right, make the change, and then next, we haven't even checked whether or not the change actually is still being, maintained or implemented 3 months after, 6 months after. What was the point in putting everybody through that stress if it didn't address the problem that we were trying to address? And we can't actually show people that it made the improvement and give them a sense of validation for why we did it. Otherwise, we get people who become cynical and talk about change for change's sake. See this in government a lot, where people really lose this, it's almost this mentality of, oh yeah, here we go again. Somebody new comes in and then they rehash this thing that was a problem 2 years ago and we tried to fix it then but didn't happen. Big part of that is just the perception about when things don't change. We could become used to things as well. All right, so what's the problem if we don't do anything about it? These are some of the statistics from the Australian Workplace Barometer project that I find quite disturbing, these numbers, right? The cost of depression to Australian business, this is just depression, not all mental health, is 6.3 billion, right? Per annum. Now, this is a white paper that I've got that talks about trauma-informed people management. There are a few white papers on the website that you might find useful, but this is one of them. I talk about the Australian Workplace Barometer project as well as giving you some ideas similar to what I'm talking to you about here. The cost to business of depression alone, right? Now, that's a big issue. What we find is that people who are mentally distressed, there's 154% loss in performance, right? It's massive. I talk to people a lot about the presenteeism that we see. They turn up to work, the lights are on, but nobody's home. They're not engaged. They're not really there doing anything. And if we often see that at certain management levels, particularly in that middle management layer, you'll get people who then try and micromanage. And what happens is the presenteeism gets worse because people will dig in their heels if they feel like they're being micromanaged too much. There's an element of this where we've got to get that into sort of personal connection between people. And a lot of that comes from those managers actually having some mental health awareness or literacy. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. There's 12% higher absenteeism in stressed workers, right? That's a lot, right? The cost of low engagement to the average business, this is from one person on a per annum basis, from that higher absenteeism and low engagement is nearly $5,000. I don't know about you, but that's a lot, right? I think that that's quite a bit of money when you're talking about one person. You know, depending on the worker, that might be 10% of their revenue. Even if it's 5% of their overall cost of their wages, that's a lot. That's a lot for us to have to kind of do that. Can you imagine if you've got that across multiple areas within the organization? There's a lot of lost time and energy there. And so I often hear it from managers, oh, yeah, but it's so hard to manage these people. And so they just want to ignore it because it feels like to engage those people properly is a lot of effort and work. And, you know, it's just a hassle. You know, people don't want to do it. They just want to get on with the job. But that is part of their job. And, you know, not wanting to have a confrontation shouldn't really be a reason that we don't want to engage with people. All right. So, just as another little thing, 34% of current workers' compensation claims with COVID are mental health related. So that's a jump. If you stop and look at, on average, it was before COVID 12%. It's now 34% from COVID. And that's massive. Like, this is a big, big looming problem. And we hear it because we hear it when we watch the news and you hear, you know, the Prime Minister talking about how we're all mentally ill. We're not. We're just very stressed. And it's stress because, you know, lots of things are outside of our control. Okay, so let me just have a quick break there before I show you, you know, a couple of other things. And I'm conscious of the time for everybody. Can you just in the comments give me one thing that you found helpful in what I've sort of talked about in this webinar? So if you're live, that's fantastic. Even later on, as I said, if you're actually later on kind of watching the replay of this, anything that you found useful from the things that I've sort of discussed so far, it would be fantastic for you to just put that into the comments, and I'll come back to that. There's a few people, I can see comments as they come through, but sometimes there's just a little lag there. All right, so as we do that, and if you sort of think about the things that are helpful, if there's any other questions, just please feel free to let me know in the comments. So Anne says, documenting after the change. Yeah, and honestly, it's one of the things that most organizations actually miss. So, you know, particularly if we make HR improvements, we don't go back and update our policies and things so that it's clear and consistent across the board. And when we embrace new technology changes, that's one of the things that I think is a really big thing as well. Helen, yeah, the Workplace Barometer Project, a really interesting one, right? It's actually quite scary when you have a look at it. And I'll talk to you about some of the other resources that are quite useful to have a look at as well as we go through. So if anybody else has found anything helpful, please just let me know and I'll come back to them. So one of the things I said to you earlier is about when we need to support our vulnerable staff members. Now, you will all have staff members who at varying points in time will give you insight to the fact that they are struggling with their mental health. I really look forward to the day when we don't have to talk about mental health as separate to physical health, because if you have a mental health issue, it's going to cause physical problems. And if you have a physical health problem, it's going to cause mental health issues. It's just our health, right? We have health issues. I think it's really important to recognize supporting vulnerable people is a lot about our mental health literacy. And we find that a lot of managers don't actually have mental health literacy. Sorry, I didn't want to move that. That it's one of the areas that I find I do quite a bit of training with organizations around improving mental health literacy in their management team. Because, when you're managing people of any sort at any level, if you're a team leader or, any kind of level, you have to have some mental health literacy. And, we've got some awareness about, what people kind of talk about when they talk about their mental health stuff. But I often say to people, don't make assumptions that you are talking the same language, because often the understanding of it is quite different. So, sometimes if somebody says that they're anxious and you've had a child who's been anxious, you can often assume that that person's behaving the same as your child, and you start treating them like your child. Doesn't work. It's not good, right? So we need to talk about mental health literacy, and then those assumptions that often come with that sort of literacy, and testing those assumptions and making sure that we're not kind of jumping in and assuming things just because somebody uses a label that we've kind of heard bandied around. It's a bit like what I said about watch the news and they talk about mental illness. Drives me mad, because it's not illness, right? It's a stress response, and it's a normal stress response that we all get to any situation that is outside of our control. So, helping people to understand that all of these things are quite normal is actually what's important, and then giving them some awareness about how we can help them manage that normal for them, right? If I have a client who talks to me about being anxious, I don't that's not a get out of jail free card, right? That's okay, so understanding that there is anxiety there. Anxiety is just fear. What is it that we can do today that means that tomorrow that might feel a little bit easier, right? You're not saying that you're not acknowledging the fear. You're not saying, I don't care, do it anyway. You're kind of going, okay, the fear is a normal part of feeling like we're going to fail or we're not doing something right. But what can I do to support you to make sure that tomorrow it doesn't feel like you've got that much fear around it anymore, because we've addressed a lot of it. So that's the point about acknowledging this mental health and improving mental health literacy within the organization. It's not about, oh, there, never mind. Yes, okay, you don't have to do anything. It's the awareness that says, okay, so I understand this is now the filter that we're using to view how you're approaching this particular project or piece of work or whatever. What can we do to improve the fact that that filter is acting as a barrier? How do we kind of lessen that so that it makes it easier for you, right? Because it's not about trying to pretend it doesn't exist, and it's not about allowing it to be used as a blocker to actually achieving a goal. It's about what do we need to do to make it feel like it's lesser of a problem later on, because we've been able to overcome or move forward. So that's an important thing, that mental health literacy. And it goes beyond mental health first aid. A lot of big organizations have jumped on the bandwagon. Oh yeah, we're all good, we've done mental health first aid. Mental health first aid is about acknowledging and being aware of the issues as they are in other people. It's not about our self perspective in it. It helps us to improve the way that we look at others, but it's quite different. All right, so I've put up some new training around this particular issue around how to create buy-in when we're looking at change management. We're putting together some new workshops. If there's anything in particular that you think would be beneficial for you, your organization, or your people, please just reach out and let us know. I'm always happy to do things like this where we provide more information to more people, because it's really an important part of improving the overall outcome. I really want to help organizations to minimize psychological injuries, because there are not enough psychologists to fix the problem if it gets created in the first place. So I'm definitely the person who says prevention is 100,000 times better than cure. And we can see from the numbers why actually getting it to a point of an injury where they're out of the workplace, it's the absolute pits. You really want to do a whole bunch of stuff to stop it actually getting to that point. So building resilience, I talk about mental muscle, building that sort of mental awareness and conscious and self-awareness in the workplace. It's a program that we run with teams that can be something that might be useful for you, because ultimately you want to be able to have resilient staff who, they've got improved flexibility, they've enhanced their focus, they've got that mental stress and strength and capacity to kind of overcome difficulties and move things forward. And that produces a level of increased endurance. So, when we get these pressured situations, I talked about the health sector at the beginning, that's just the reality of this pressured situation that we were going to have to deal with at some point, right? Because COVID, the nature of it, it just had to get to this place at some point. And really what politicians have been trying to do is work out that balance of when's the tipping point that we can kind of go, okay, well, we just have to tip it over now and hope that we can contain it as the best we can. That's what's happened. All right. If you have a larger organization and you're interested in understanding what your organization's psychological injury risk might be, I'm just going to prepare you for the fact that if you're not in a HR role, depending on the size of the organization, small organization, you're probably going to be answering all of this, no problem. Large organization, this is really something that the HR area would need to have a look at, or really senior management who can get access to the information in it. Because, there's some base numbers and things that you want to kind of understand when you're going through it. But the scorecard results actually give you an overall assessment, but it also breaks it down into the 5 key areas. Now, the 5 key areas that we talk about happen to also be the 5 keys that were identified for business out of this recent Black Dog report that came out, I think it was October last year. Modern work, how changes to the way that we work is impacting Australians' mental health. So they've got 5 keys in there that they address for business. And the 5 keys they talk about are training your leaders. And that's where I talk about in the risk assessment, it's looking at how you manage people, empowering your people, which is where I talk to you about your HR stuff. Intervening early is the prevention elements that I talk about in the scorecard. Prevention, and in this case, prevention is the stuff that we're talking about now around change management. Change, we know, is the number one, it is the biggest risk for psychological injury. And so if we can address that, we're going to make our biggest impact on preventing those injuries for our business and within the organization. And then they talk about transition, which is what I refer to as agility. And that's really how adaptive or agile your organization is to new improvements, technology-wise or whatever else. So my challenge to you for 2022 is, how do you create a psychologically healthy workplace? Because 4 in 5 Australians have reported psychological distress from COVID, right? And that's kind of just, again, been blowing up in our faces. So it could be you, it could be your partner, it could be your boss, it could be off-site staff, might be peers or stakeholders, your PA, your colleagues, could be any one of them. But if we're talking 4 in 5, then it's the majority of us, not the minority anymore. We've kind of turned the mental health statistics on their head. It used to be 20% of people reported a mental health situation. Now it's like 80%. Right? That's pretty big. We need to be aware. All right, new book. So The Trouble with Trauma came out in November 2020 because I wanted to push that out to get it out for people for COVID to help them understand themselves and why it was causing a problem. I am in the process of writing a new book around the trouble with trauma for organizations. So I'm going to be interviewing some senior leaders and, heads of organizations, businesses who are doing really good things in this space, or they've had difficulties with these sorts of issues and they've overcome them by making change in their organization. And I'm going to be talking to people who have experienced workplace psychological injuries and about what are the things that we could have done that would have made it better. This book is about giving you some opportunity for improvement. It's not about browbeating people about the things that they did wrong. It's not about putting blame at that, oh, everybody messed up. And it's the one thing I wish I could really get through to people, is that the sort of things that we do, when I work with an organization, I'm not interested in placing blame. I'm interested in helping to prevent these issues being an ongoing problem for the organization. All right. So, are there any questions now? Because we're nearly to the end and I'm really kind of, oh no, Siri wants to talk to me. No, I'm going to make her be quiet. Few minutes. Any questions? I noticed Hannah made a bigger comment. It'd be really interesting to make the statistics known to younger workers, help them understand how their mental state can impact the way that they turn up at work, and that it's important to take time to keep ourselves healthy and find work easier. Absolutely. I think it's one of the things that we have to understand. It's really important to understand, especially with millennials coming into the workspace. For those of you who are parents of millennials, I'm sorry, I'll say this quickly, but we caused a massive problem. And we caused a massive problem because, and I should say not we, because my girls are a bit older than that, but we've caused an issue because we've raised a whole generation who can't solve their own problems. So part of what has happened with that generation is that they grew up with two working parents, often in childcare or after school care and those sorts of things. We as parents were pressured to, you always busy, got to work, got to do stuff, got to do, and so when the child is actually having an issue, most of the time it's easier for the parent to just step in and fix the problem. And what happens is we've got a whole generation then who have learned helplessness because they have a problem. They just kind of go, oh, I've got a problem. And even the mental health literacy of young people is really good. But we gave them the get out of jail free card. They go, I've got a problem because I'm anxious, or I'm my mood's low or whatever. Yes, it is. What can we do to support you and help you through that, rather than letting it stop you from doing anything? Because it's the inability to solve the problem that's the issue. All right. So I hope that helps. I'm just going to check if anybody else has any other comments or questions or anything that they might want to put into the comments. The dog's behind me telling me that he wants to go out. And so I'm just conscious of the fact that we, coming to an end. And if you found that useful, please, if you don't have any more comments for me now, no problems. That's okay. If you found it useful, please maybe tag some of your work colleagues or some other people in the comments below to get them to have a look at some of this stuff. Even if there's something that you say to them, I just 5 minutes in where she talks about blah, 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 that might be helpful to them so that they don't have to sit there and watch the whole thing. If there's anything that you would really like me to sort of focus on, we're running live events at 12 o'clock every Wednesday. Then we're running a webinar like this once a month. So the next one of these will be in 4 weeks' time. I think it's the 17th of February, somewhere in there. And no problem. I'm getting some thank yous. No problem, Adele. Always welcome. So when we start sort of looking at these things, if there's anything in the lives that you would like me to talk about or address, please just sort of make some comments and we're going to pick up on those on the way through and make sure that we can address those. If there's anything else that you might need, or you want to pick my brains from a strategic problem that you may have within your organization, when you get the follow-up email from today, there's an opportunity to look at booking a discovery call, and that might be worthwhile. If you are a person who thinks that your organization's done some really great stuff in the mental health space and you'd like to be interviewed for the book, please also reach out and let me know what it is that that you've done that is really noteworthy, and we'll see what we can do. All right. So the website on the bottom of the screen there, if you need any further information, please feel free to go to that, kerryhoward.com.au. No worries, Helen. A supportive, practical, and non pathologizing view. Yes, I would agree, because I'm not a real fan of the pathology side of things. I think it's useful to have labels to help people understand themselves a little bit, but it's not a really useful thing to kind of allow it to, that's the end. I don't have to do any more because this is my label, right? I don't think that helps anybody. And I think we just have to recognize that as human beings, you know what? We all have challenges at different points, and we just need some practical advice and support to get through those challenges. Because I don't know any human being who doesn't actually, at different points in their life, have problems of one sort or another. All right. So I hope that helped, and I will see you soon.